Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for coming out to our Congress to Campus event. We've had a wonderful full day with our members who are here visiting us. I'm Dr. Carrie Eves. I'm an assistant professor of political science and policy studies. And I orchestrated this event, and we're so excited that it's come to fruition. We've had a really great day. I know our students have really appreciated their interactions with our two members. So the plan for tonight is that I'm going to toss them a few questions, and then I'll step aside and let them talk and answer those, and we'll see where it goes. If needed, I'll get up and prod with a few more questions. And then as we get about halfway through, maybe 45 minutes in, we do have a mic, and it's all small enough you may just be able to stand up and talk loudly. We'll open it up to audience questions as well. So let me quickly introduce our two former members of Congress that are here with us. I want to quickly give a shout out to the Association of Former Members of Congress that helps sponsor this program. We're really grateful for all of their support. First, we have joining us former Representative Glenn English, a Democrat from Oklahoma who served starting in 1975, won election in 1974, and served up until 1994. He has the distinction of serving for 20 years, and he was in the majority party that entire time, so he can share some of those experiences with us. We also have, fresh off of his service in Congress, former Representative Peter Roskam, who represented the Chicago area, and he comes to us just after leaving the House, so he has 10 years of service, am I correct? 12, I'm so sorry. 12 years of service in the House to draw on. So I've been really grateful for this wonderful pairing where we have some historical and then a really current experience on Capitol Hill. So let me start you guys off with a question, and then I'll let you just sort of run with it. So before I had you here, I quick looked up the congressional approval ratings. You want to take a guess what they are right now?
Under 20.
Yes. So 18.6% of people on average from Real Clear Politics say that they approve of Congress. The disapproval rating is at 71%. So my question is sort of, what can we do about that? Or is it something we should be concerned about at all, right? Most people report that they like their member, but then we get this stat when we think about Congress as an institution. So I want to sort of throw that to you, and you could talk about sort of the health of the institution as it comes to sort of its public reputation.
So I think, to put a finer point on it, most people tend to like their own members of Congress, and then they wonder, well, who are those rascals that other people have sent to Congress? And I think therein lies part of the challenge, and in fact, part of the charm of our system. So the fact that the institution as a whole is not highly regarded is not really a big surprise to me. And I think we've got to recognize that the founders created a system that was designed to restrain power. And sometimes in the restraint of power, there's not a lot of celebration. You know what I mean? There's another challenge here too, and I think we're going to be able to get into this, Carrie, a little bit more this evening. When Congress is working together, when people are working on a bipartisan basis on substantive things, many, many, many times that is not broadly communicated out in the media. So I'll give you two quick examples. In the last Congress, very serious and thoughtful work was put together dealing with the opioid crisis. Really good work that was a compromise from a lot of different perspectives, and I will make a prediction to you. I think in 10 years' time, our country will be having a different and better conversation on opioids than we're having right now. And that's the basis of this work. Now, did you hear about it? No. What you basically heard is when people are snarling at one another on television and barking at one another, and that's what gets a lot of attention. Similarly, there's a national consensus that developed that our prison sentencing system had gotten off kilter, and that there were some sentences, many sentences, in fact, patterns of sentences that were unjust. And what you saw then on a bipartisan basis was people working together to update this, signed into law by the President of the United States, that is transformational and really significant. Did you hear much about it? No, you didn't hear much about it. What you hear about are the things that we can all talk about, the wall, shutdown, this, that, and the other thing. But my point is that when Congress is working together, it doesn't get the attention that it deserves. Just last quick point. This quarter, I'm teaching a seminar at the University of Chicago. And I have titled the seminar that I'm teaching this, So You Think Congress is Broken. And then we're walking through a number of things. And my point to the students is that there are many attributes of the United States Congress that are being criticized right now. And okay, should they be criticized? Or are those design features that are put in place by the founders as a restraining influence on the consolidation of power?
Peter, I believe when I left Congress that the approval of Congress was over 20%.
Now you're talking.
So, in all seriousness, I think Peter's absolutely right. The issue that you come down to is that people like their member of Congress because that's who they hear from. They really don't hear from all these other people, so whatever they disagree with in federal policy, certainly in legislation or actions taken or not taken by Congress, they blame on everybody else. So it becomes more of an institutional thing as opposed to a personal thing when you're talking about the individual member from their district that they see and comes home town hall meetings and they get acquainted with and voted for and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's part of it. The other thing is you've got all these people, all these faces. You got 434 other House members. You got 100 senators. And, and they see them on TV, and as Peter's saying, they're barking back and forth at each other on different issues because that's what sells and gets the audience on TV. That's what sells ads, is that audience, and they're looking for an audience. And now you're into social media, which makes it even worse. So all that exacerbates, I think, that particular feeling. The other part of it is I don't think the population of this country is as focused today as it was when I was there on results. And I think there was more of an era that once you were elected to office and you got into office, there was, I think, a need to show that you've done something, to produce something. You got to have something to take home at the next election. Today, it's too easy for a lot of these folks, I think, to make some extreme statement to prove, how emphatic I am in my support or opposition. Usually it's opposition to whatever item it is that they think they find favor within their district or with a particular group in their district. So, I think it would be nice if we could get back to the question of saying if you can't produce, then why re-elect you? And demand some kind of production in that area. Maybe we could shift the debate back over in the discussion as to how you get something done. I see another terrible problem that we have right now, though, is that we can't agree on facts. And I think that's part of the reason. Peter was a staff guy back when I was a member, a part of that period. So he was coming in as I was beginning to get to the point where I was phasing out. So we overlap. But the issue I think you had back in those days, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, people generally agreed on what the problem was. And then you got in some debate back and forth as how do you solve the problem? These days you got people denying there even is a problem. And we've got that with so many issues. And I think it's getting worse, not getting better, as people don't want to deal with the issues, so they just in denial. I'll add one other thing, and given where we are in time and given the fact it's been a while since I've been in office, I think I'll take some liberty in doing this. I think these days you've got an awful lot of people who believe whatever I've got in my head that I believe is fact and truth, and anything that shows up that doesn't agree with that is a lie. And I've got to say, I think that's a bit arrogant. And I think it's certainly a bit selfish and certainly contrary to what, this collective thing as a form of government that was put together. It was based on the fact that you would cooperate with each other to solve problems. And so that I think is a very dangerous thing. Maybe at some point why we're going to stub our toe enough that people are going to come around and say, oh my God, we got to do something to solve the problem, and I'm willing to cooperate with my neighbor to get it done. That's historically kind of what we have done. We did it with the Great Depression in the 1930s. Certainly we did it in World War II. And we had all this discussion about the greatest generation and all that. That came out of cooperation. That came out of people working together, and certainly it came out of compromise. And once again, I'm hopeful we're going to see compromise come back into vogue, that's the way you get things done. Not everybody's going to get everything they want. And that's just a fact. You can't get anything accomplished and get every blooming thing that you want personally. It's just not going to happen. So anyway, okay.
That leads really nicely to my next question.
Uh-oh.
You did a great job setting me up.
I'm
Thank
sorry
you.
I did that.
That's okay. So, talking about this idea of compromise and results in Congress, one of the things I preach over and over in my Congress class is that it's a lot easier to stop things from happening in Congress than it is to get them to happen. But yet we want to see results. And there are things I've heard students ask you questions about, things like climate change, or we've talked about the debt and deficit, big problems. So a question for you is, what would it take for us to see Congress pass some of these bills that we call landmark legislation, right? These big bills. Can you foresee a situation in which they would pass under divided government, or would it take massive one-party control for something like that to happen? What's it going to take for Congress to sort of move on some of these really big issues?
I think we're a little bit oversimplifying a couple of those points that you made. I think one point that you're making total control by one party. I don't think as much as it's one party as much as it is a similar interest. I could get together with Republicans in Texas, for instance, and we could certainly agree with regard to oil and gas policy because we have very similar economic interests, very similar constituencies, and we'd be in agreement. Peter may totally disagree with what Republicans and Democrats in Texas and Oklahoma come up with, and they have a completely different idea. So that's a little bit of an oversimplification. I think it still comes back to the problem issue, and some of the problems that we've got today. I know many people are interested in the climate change thing. I believe, Peter, you were in the Congress at the time. Maybe you may disagree with me on it. But whatever, the climate change bill that Pelosi was pushing that passed the House of Representatives and went to the Senate, that legislation could very well have passed. But it was not taken up it was Democrats passed it in the House, went over to a Democratic Senate, and the Senate did not take it up because of the fact that they wanted to push health care. And you couldn't ask these guys to take on both of those major issues, casting very difficult votes back to back. That's in reality what happened. In my opinion, if they had taken up, because the association I represented and I was a part of that discussion in the House, we had some real issues with regard to the way it's treated coal-fired generation. And the provisions that are in the bill, as well as the rest of the industry, had some concerns. But we were convinced that if we could get over to the Senate with this legislation, that we could fix the legislation and be able to deal and obtain a long-term solution to this problem that would enable us to go back to consumers from the standpoint of electric cooperatives, go back to those consumers and say that we were going to be able to have stable electric rates, which was our whole objective. So it could have been accomplished. But in this particular case, the leadership in the Senate had a different priority, and it basically the priority, I think, came in the White House. And so they rammed through health care instead of climate change. Looking back on it, you also had the issue of economics during that period. I think we would have been far better off, and I'm saying this as a Democrat, and particularly looking in hindsight right now, if we had taken up dealing with the economy and economic recovery and focused on climate change as opposed to doing health care and come back and double back and done health care at a later date, not being able to work out something for Republicans, and it would have been a bipartisan bill. If it had been a bipartisan bill, we'd had a different situation, I think, going forward there too. So, but that's a lot of hindsight. So what I'm saying here, this is not just a simple Democrat and Republican thing. It's a regional thing. It's an interest thing. And so you have a lot of different factions. And I think if that had been the case, we could have worked out an arrangement that we would have gotten several Republicans in the Senate who were strong supporters in rural states of electric cooperatives who would have supported that climate change bill. I think we could have got that done. I wish we had.
Kerry, let me get to one of the phrases, the adjective that you used to describe the legislation, and that was landmark legislation. So hold that thought. Then I want to take you to a conference call that I was on, this is several years ago, with business leaders in Chicago who wanted to see Congress take on the issue of immigration. 5 years ago, it's been a hot issue for a long time. 5 years ago, it was hot from a business point of view. They were very concerned about the direction that it was going, and they wanted to see a solution coming out of Congress. And they were not happy with me because I told them, you've got to break this process down. And you've got to take one thing and then deal with another thing and so forth. Now here's what I mean by that. The idea that we are an all or nothing legislative body, I think is we need to challenge that. So go back to Thomas Jefferson. And I know if I'm throwing founding fathers at you, I'm not playing fair. And I don't mean to play fair. I want to persuade you tonight. Thomas Jefferson, no stranger to the big picture. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence, one of the biggest, most thoughtful works of the last several centuries. 14 years after he writes the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson writes a letter to a Christian pastor, a guy named Charles Clay. And I'm going to give you 3 lines from this letter. And this is exactly what he's communicating. I've looked at it in context. This is not taken out of context. This is what Jefferson writes. Think about this in terms of the phrase landmark legislation. He wrote, "The ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. We must be content what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. It takes time to persuade men even to do what is for their own good." So that's Jefferson's admonition, take things one step at a time. He literally wrote, take it by inches. Now go back to the conference call. The conference call is a call where I said, folks, you got to break this issue down. Immigration, break it down. The idea of an all or nothing, one size fits all, we're going to pass immigration reform and it's all going to be great, I said on this call, is a pipe dream. Instead, break it down. The first thing you've got to do is you've got to deal with the border. Now, the wall discussion wasn't even around then, but you can imagine a secure border. If you have a secure border, some level of security that is by some international standard, I've seen this in polling, I've seen it in focus groups, and you can take somebody who is very, very concerned about us being, quote, too liberal on immigration, and if they're convinced that the border is secure, the wattage of the discussion drops precipitously. I mean, it drops way, way down. Then all of a sudden, you can have the next discussion. And in my constituency in suburban Chicago, that was about high-skilled visas. Then it was about low-skilled visas. Then it was about the ability to say, all right, we've done all these things. We've dealt with the high-skilled workers. We've dealt with the guest worker program. We've got a secure border. Now take a breath. What do you want to do with 12 million people who are here? Because we're not going to throw them out of the country. We'd go into an economic recession if we did that. And we're not going to, we got to deal with this. And do you see how the dynamic all changes, or the disposition of people all changes? But I think the challenge is us falling in as a culture into this all or nothing stuff. Or if it becomes all or nothing, here's the easiest rule in politics, then it's nothing. You know, the safest place to be on a controversial piece of legislation is vote no. Think about it. That is the safest place. Because you can tell anybody, oh, Sophie, I thought that bill wasn't good enough, so I voted no. Oh, I voted no because it was too strong. I voted no. You take my point. If you want to try and create an environment where people can get to yes, then you've got to create the environment where people can get to yes. And it is much easier to get to yes on small incremental things to create a different dynamic than all the way around. So one other quick point. I was part of the Climate Solutions Caucus because I was interested in sort of the shifting nature of that debate. And as we talked about a little bit at dinner earlier, there's different ways to approach this. One is federal mandates, one is private sector solutions, and so forth. And my view is that there was some good common ground there. One other point, though, quickly. We tend to be big legislative bodies reflecting a big country like the United States. We tend to be crisis-driven institutions. That's just the nature of it. We tend to be crisis-driven institutions. We tend not to move until there's something big and that we've got to deal with. And I think we're going to be much better off in the long run if we take incremental steps towards crises that we see coming. Then you get the best of both worlds. Then you get the advantage of time working at both ends of the spectrum. But you can take these smaller bites. Now what we need to do culturally is we need to get out of the zero-sum game element of politics and that trap that we are all in right now. And it's not a good thing. And it's not the way we normally live our lives. So the way we live our politics right now is I am successful at my opponent's demise. Mm-hmm. If my opponent is successful, that comes at my expense. And I'm telling you, for years when I was practicing law, at the end of the disposition of some case where we settled the documents and everybody's walking away, I never walked back into the room and told the other lawyer, oh, we really stuck it to you. Mm-hmm. You know, who does that? We don't do business this way. We don't do commerce this way. And yet we've fallen into this trap of doing politics this way. And so it could be that the students here can be part of changing that culture. It could be that there's an opportunity to sort of refresh and to reframe these things episodically. And every once in a while, there's great moments that come along in American history where countries can reflect and say, let's do this differently. And this may be one of those moments.
Let me throw an amen on top of what Peter said. If you look at the past 250 years, what you find is that legislation that is the best legislation, that stands the test of time legislation, is usually legislation that's taken a while to cook. So, you know, the quickie bill that runs in to solve this particular problem or that particular problem, particularly if it's a high-profile issue, probably isn't going to be very good. There's a reason, I think, if you take some of the humongous landmark legislation and it's passed, you'll find that legislation gets revised 4 or 5 times over the next decade. It just has to have those kinds of corrections. You're not going to get all of that right. In some ways, and to go to what Peter was saying, which another way, it's almost works to the disadvantage of legislation dealing with an issue like immigration to have it high profile. You're almost better off if it isn't high profile, which I think is another way of getting at what you're saying on the small bites. You don't have that, it's not up there a red flag waving for everybody to shoot at or rally around, and that's what gets you into this stuff. But again, you're back to this thing that this system of government that this country has is designed for compromise. Compromise. The Constitution is a result of compromise. It wasn't written by a bunch of guys that said, we're not going to compromise. It was compromise. I mean, you never would have gotten the Constitution adopted if it weren't for compromise. And here we're coming into the same thing, and we're expecting for some reason today that whatever is written down, that there be no compromise. You know, it just doesn't make any sense. It's completely contrary. Well, it goes back to the thing, most people in this country don't know history, don't know a blooming thing about it. So they don't know what's gone before. They don't know what experiences the country has had, and that works to our disadvantage too, I think, in reaching compromise. And I couldn't help but say amen on what you were saying.
Okay. So I'm going to move us a little bit, but we'll stay in the same area. In particular, I'm thinking about how you said Congress is a crisis institution. So I'm going to ask us a question that has to do with what's happening right at this very moment. So we had the president make an emergency declaration, and you don't necessarily have to tell us what you think about that. I want to think about it in a larger picture for Congress. And as I was thinking about asking you this question, I ran across a statement from one of our senators here in North Carolina, and Senator Tillis said about this that I'm quoting directly from him, that Congress has allowed executive overreach to continue unabated from one administration to the next because both sides are fine with it as long as they agree with the policy goal. So sort of laying blame at the feet of Congress, right, for sort of abdicating power to the president. And I was hoping that you guys could speak about sort of whether or not you agree with that statement. It doesn't, again, like I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be about this emergency declaration, just sort of at large. Has Congress sort of conceded too much power? They have that Article 1, right, that primary role. Are they instead relying on the courts to weigh in and letting the president go unchecked? So I was hoping you could speak to that current issue that we're facing.
So let me give you a little bit of a perspective on the emergency declaration, just by way of context, because I do think it was a mistake on the part of President Trump to declare an emergency, and I'm a critic of that. Look, there's an urgency to the issue, but emergency is the common understanding of emergency. And I was a critic when President Obama said, I have a pen and a phone, when he was asserting executive authority, when he was very declarative and very aggressive on the immigration issue as well. So I think we need to be very, very careful about the ebb and flow of power between these co-equal branches of government. Now, what part of it is the diminution of congressional power, Article 1 power, in my view, over the years has taken place based on a level of complexity of things that people are legislating about. So the remedy was, well, since Congress can't necessarily deal with and master all of these different things, subtleties of the Food and Drug Administration or environmental things, or, you can imagine, Congress said, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to create an agency, and we are going to delegate authority to that agency, and they're going to make these decisions. And therein lies the authority of a federal agency. When a federal agency promulgates a rule, it has what? It has the power of law. You can't just blow off a federal agency's rule. Well, that's become imbalanced. And what you've seen now over the past couple of years is Congress also put in place what is known as the Congressional Review Act. The Congressional Review Act is a reclamation of that authority. And it says Congress can void out some regulations without having to put something back on the president's desk. And it can just void that by operation of both houses of Congress. So yes, there's been a constant tussle between the branches. Glenn came in at a time, and I'll defer to him to tell you a time when Congress was asserting itself over the executive branch, and now you've seen this flow the other direction. The courts are, there's been an aggressive nature, I would argue, on the part of the courts for the last generation or so, and now there's a receding somewhat based on the judicial philosophy of some of the people on the courts over the past few decades in terms of pulling back and so forth. So here's the bottom line as far as I'm concerned. There's an ebb and flow to this. The relationship between these three co-equal branches is not static. And there's a beauty in that there's pressure and it moves and it changes vis-a-vis one another. Because remember, our founders, what was their desire? Their desire was to restrain power. Many of them were deeply committed Christians. The ones who weren't Christians had a sympathetic Christian worldview and at least understood what? Original sin. They understood human nature, and they didn't trust it. And so they said, we're going to come up with something that's going to reject a monarchy. They also rejected a parliamentary system. You want to know why? A parliament is basically a legislative gang, where one faction gains control of both the executive and the legislative powers for a date certain. Our founders said, no, none of that for us. we're going to come up with 3 co-equal branches, place them in perpetual tension, and there's an ebb and a flow to it. There's a brilliance to it, but I'm of the view that this tends to right itself over a period of time. And I think, Glenn, it'd be really interesting for them to hear about the season that you came into Congress, because that was historic.
Well, not much question. I was elected, as pointed out, in '74. I'm what's known as one of the Watergate babies. If you don't know about the Watergate babies, Watergate produced a lot of Democrats in a lot of Republican districts, mostly rural, who came into Congress. There were 75 of us that year. I mean, you know, this last election, this last year, they're talking about, well, this was the biggest group of Democrats coming in the House since '75. Well, we were the 75. And we weren't all alike, but we had an awful lot of people who were activists that weren't going to take a back seat to anybody, and you talk about shaking up Congress, they shook the thing up. They beat 3 committee chairmen right off the bat, that had some of the most senior members in Congress. And there was no turning back. It took power away from the speaker. It took power wherever they could get it. And they were very aggressive as far as what was being done as far as the presidency was concerned. And obviously, Watergate weakened the presidency a great deal. Jerry Ford was weakened to a great extent because of the pardon that he gave Nixon. And so, you know, you were kind of into that kind of a situation. And the committees and subcommittee chairmen got far more power than I think any time that they've had since, certainly not since '94. I don't think after '94 they were nearly as powerful. But I want to get back a little bit to what you were talking about on the point of the legislation. Some of this is probably good. I hate to tell you this, but not every member of Congress is all-knowing, an expert in every blooming field there is, you know, to be legislated on in this country. They're just not there. Even the staffs don't have that kind of knowledge and background. And they're not all that confident in a lot of the expertise we get for some of the agencies and departments. You know, you kind of wonder, well, is this an administration position, or are they shooting straight with me as to what the truth really is? But as you get into very complex, difficult legislation, what you find is that the members of Congress say we can go up to a point. And we've got to allow an agency or a department to have some flexibility to cover a wide range of different situations that may arise that we can't foresee. I mean, you can write the darn legislation so tight that nobody can live under it. So there is that aspect. You've got to have some flexibility that you give them. There is also this other piece, if it's really very sophisticated, complex stuff that you don't have the expertise to, the Congress does have a tendency, we did even, as insistent as we were on the power, we would give the agency and department some flexibility to be able to make the proper interpretation. But you're assuming they're going to. Now, unfortunately, we came up with a perfect solution. If you want to know the solution to all this stuff, it took place in 1978. In 1978, the Congress, in its wisdom, the bunch of firebrands came in and said, we're not so sure about all these rules and regulations these guys are coming up with, and we know in many cases what they're doing over the administration is not stuff that we approve of, the Congress approves of, or whatever. And they came up with the bright idea of one House veto. You remember the one House veto? You don't remember the one House veto. That's unfortunate. We passed legislation, and it was signed into law, believe it or not, by President Carter, in which if a single House, either the House or the Senate, came up with a regulation or a rule that they disagreed with, that was a privileged motion to bring it to the floor, and I think you had 2 weeks for the leadership must bring it to the floor for an up or down vote. Wasn't any of this stuff of, you know, dancing around it or anything else. And if either house disapproved of that regulation was out. That was it. And so that seemed like a perfect answer. You know, I mean, if you're going to give them some flexibility, here you got a string you can yank and pull this thing back and say that isn't what we meant, go back and try again. And but we had a little problem. and that is someone, and I don't even remember who it was, got the bright idea of taking this to the court. And the court, as they so often do, screwed it up. Took it to the Supreme Court. Justice Scalia came up with this opinion that states that it is unconstitutional because under our form of governance, both the House and Senate must pass it. So you couldn't have a single veto from a House. It had to be a House and Senate thing. But if Scalia had left that thing alone and it passed, we would have certainly avoided a whole lot of problems down the road. I think the legislation passed by Congress would have been a whole lot better than some of this stuff that we've had to live with. And if you're looking at over the long term of 20 years or so on a piece of legislation, how well it wears, it has a tendency to get out of whack. And you start having agencies and departments that start making interpretations that are beyond what was ever intended by Congress. This would have been a way to get at that. But as I said, what could have been, but it wasn't. But since then, it's the kind of complexity that Peter's talking about, and you just have this difficulty, and it's a constant struggle with trying to get a department or an agency, and it's not even all the time the White House. We get into all this, it's president and this and that. The greatest frustration Jack Kennedy had when he was president was with the State Department and trying to get the State Department bureaucracy to carry out his policy as President of the United States. And the way that an awful lot of people in these agencies and departments look at career people in particular, they look at it from the standpoint and say, you know, I was here before you came and I'm going to be here when you leave. And they'll outweight you. And that's a lot of what he was talking about in trying to get things done along the lines that he'd like to go. And I'm sure Donald Trump has the same frustration within the bureaucracy, and members of Congress have had that. But that's the career people play a big role, and they are part of the checks and balances, but boy, it's a frustrating process. It is a frustrating thing. These are unelected people many times you don't even know who in the heck they are, and you have to dig and dig and dig trying to find out where's the problem of getting this thing done the way it's supposed to be done. And sometimes you never find out. They stay pretty well hidden. But it's a constant struggle. But Congress has no choice. They've got to allow flexibility for the two reasons I mentioned.
All right. Again, you set me up very nicely. So another area that might be frustrating to members of the House would be the Senate. Your counterparts on the other side of the building in the Senate.
Oh, the House of Lords. That's what
right.
referring to as the House of Lords.
We haven't really spoken about them that much today, so I thought I would ask you a question. Big and broad. I wanted you to talk about sort of the relationship between the House and the Senate. And if you're in the majority in the House, you can get done whatever you want. In the Senate, the rules are very different.
Well, I'm not even sure they have rules. Do they have rules in the Senate?
Oh, man, don't get me going.
It's questionable, right? So that's what I wanted you both to speak to. What do you, as a member of the House, what's your feeling about the Senate? Is it frustrating, necessary? Would you get rid of the whole thing? Would you make them another version of the House? Talk a little bit about how you feel about the Senate.
So they say that in the House you have the other party as your opponent. The Senate is your enemy. And there's a lot to that. So the institutions are different. The best description that I've heard is somebody once said that the House of Representatives is like that hot cup of coffee that you can barely hold on to, and the Senate is the cooling sleeve. And together, at least in theory, they're supposed to work together. Now, and there's some truth to that in terms of the House tends to be emotional. The House tends to be it turns over, you know, all 435 seats are up every 24 months. Think about that, as opposed to only a third of the Senate, and it has sort of a stabilizing thing. So the House tends to be tribal. You got one tribe and you got the other tribe, and there's attempts to work together that I've described, but institutionally, it's tribal. There's two teams. The Senate is different. The Senate is filled with 100 people who are all passive-aggressive, who are walking around, every one of whom can grind the place to a halt. They can put a hold on something. And so this process then creates a place that tends to slow things down. Now, I'm overstating this for the sake of sort of illustration.
Not much.
But you take my point. They're really quite different institutions. The House has the upper hand in terms of the initiative on one issue, and the Senate has the upper hand in terms of the initiative on another issue. The House, under the Constitution, takes the initiative in terms of tax policy. So you'll remember Article 1 of the Constitution says tax bills have to originate in the House of Representatives. And that's the only thing where the House kind of has a senior position over the Senate. Appropriations bills. The Senate is the dominant legislative body as it relates to foreign policy. And it is a very, very significant role through its appointment process with ambassadors and the confirmation of treaties and so forth. I am of the opinion that the Senate filibuster rule has outworn its welcome. And I know that that may be a little unorthodox, but I look at the Senate filibuster rule, which is the rule, by the way, not scripture, not the inspired word of God, not the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution, a rule in the United States Senate. In the words of my son Steve, I'm just saying, it's just a rule. So this is a rule whose days, I think, have come and gone. And it was designed to be kind of an emergency lever that says we're going to require a supermajority. We're going to require 60 senators to begin discussing something. Okay? This is not passage. This is to discuss something. So the challenge is the House can produce all kinds of good bills, and whether it's Nancy Pelosi as Speaker, Paul Ryan as Speaker, or whoever, but then are never even considered in the United States Senate. I think that's a weakness, and I would argue for the abolition of the Senate filibuster rule. If Senator Mitch McConnell were here, however, he would dazzle you with examples and give you a very, very, very impressive presentation about how great the Senate filibuster rule is. So I'll stipulate that that it's controversial, but based on what I've seen, I think it's worn out its welcome, and I'd say it's time to go.
Well, McConnell's BS aside, I think that the issue that we're really looking at is the fact that both of these houses have different functions. The House of Representatives is supposed to be the people's house. You have 2-year terms for specifically the purpose so that people's voices can be heard. And that's the reason you have 2-year terms. And it is a way in which making certain that the views of people are reflected. Founding fathers understood that people get crazy sometimes. And they didn't really trust the people all that much, to be honest about it. When you look at it, they trusted the landowners. They didn't really trust the folks, the unwashed masses. But anyway, the people then are supposed to have their will done in the House, and then as Peter pointed out, you go over to the Senate where you supposedly have the wisest, and it wasn't women, it was the wisest 2 men in each state who were appointed to the United States Senate by the state, or appointed to the U.S. Senate by the state legislature. That's how it came. They weren't elected. They were appointed. So that gives you some idea kind of what the purpose was and where this comes from. What we've had now, once we went to election of senators, and then over the period of time, in some cases, well, in many cases, you have senators acting like House members. They really don't perform their function. They don't, and quite frankly, I think some would argue that in recent times they haven't done anything much along the lines the way they were intended, because basically they haven't taken the heat. You got 6-year terms to take the fire. And if you aren't willing to stand up and take the fire, then why have you? So you might as well abolish the United States Senate. If they all want to be House members, let them run for the House. Because that's really the way these guys act many times. But that's the reality is they have different functions, different responsibilities, and they're supposed to be carried out, in different ways. And whether I'm for an issue or against an issue is whether I think the filibuster's a good idea or bad. So
Right.
we'll go for that. But that's pretty much where this comes up. I will say one last thing. When I was a House member, anytime that I'd hear about a House member who wanted to run for the United States Senate, I started viewing them with great suspicion. I started wondering, can they be trusted? Can they really be trusted? No, I'm kidding with a lot of that on the senators. I like to mess with them a little bit. They do consider, every senator over there, and this has been said time and time again, every senator views himself as a future president. That's just where they are. That's where they come from. My head is in this. I'm so smart. I'm so aloof, And us lowly House members, of course, they don't want to be bothered with us. That's really what it comes down to. But many times they have to be bothered. And it was always fun going to conference with the Senate. I always enjoyed going to conference with the Senate because the one thing that you'll find out, back me up on this now.
I'm with you.
Don't let me get in trouble. The one thing you'd find out is that on nearly every conference committee, almost any, not all, but almost any House member on a conference committee would know more about the details of the legislation than any senator.
Oh, yeah.
So, the greatest fun I always had is when we go to conference, I'd say, well, I think if it's all right with the senators, we should simply clear the room of all staff. And we'll get down and get this deal done.
Panic.
And you saw the panic. Staff members is because I guarantee you get that staff member out there and the House would have their sides prevail every time we could clean their clock every time we'd do it. So anyway, but that was fun days.
All right.
I asked one senator who I served with in the House. He had been in the Senate for a year or so, and I said, "Hey, what's it like over there?" He looked around to make sure nobody was around. He goes, "It's like moving in with your grandparents." That's what it's like.
Well, it was fun.
All right, I'm going to ask you both one quick question,
right.
and then I'll open it up for other questions from the audience instead of me just monopolizing all your time. But I was wondering if you had the chance, or if you were asked from one of this new class of members who's come into Congress, or any new member, what one lesson would you give them? What's the best piece of advice you could give them as they start off this new Congress? You're here at a really interesting time as we kick off this new Congress. So what would you tell them?
I had this discussion with a new member of Congress a couple weeks ago, and urged this person to realize that they can convene very interesting people. That as a member of Congress, you can pretty much get your phone calls returned within reason, to a lot of people. And you can also get a lot of people who are willing to come in and talk to you and teach you about issues. And so I said, just be mindful of that and be intellectually curious and gather and get information and perspective. And it doesn't even have to be, just learn more about these issues. So your ability to gather and your ability to have access to some of the brightest people out there is really breathtaking. So use it to your benefit in your service.
Use great care in hiring your staff people, particularly those people in your district. And second, identify the people in your committees, staff people on the committees, as well as members, who are knowledgeable about issues that you're concerned about, and keep your mouth shut. Keep your mouth shut. Too many freshmen want to get up and start making pronouncements they have no idea about, and they get way over their skis and get themselves in an awful lot of trouble, and there's no reason for them to make those ground pronouncements, but they've just got to open up their mouth and get themselves in trouble. And we've had some on the Democratic side since this last election who've done that.
All right. Well, with that advice, I'll open it up to questions. I think we have a microphone. Thank you. So if anybody has a question for our members, we'll field those now.
We're happy to take easy questions
Yeah,
that make us look good, Liam. I'm counting on you.
I don't think did we ban him from asking more questions? He's already been sharpshooting us.
Go ahead.
I got one more.
Yeah.
Recently, I read in the news that there's been some tiny discussion on expanding the size of the House. because our legislature is small in comparison to a lot of international legislatures. Can you talk about if that would be a good thing because you think it would expand representation, or if you think the House is already too large?
I don't think it would be a good thing. I think the House is big enough now. I wouldn't describe it as too large, but it's big. 435 people is a big legislative body, and I would not, without some other factor that I can't contemplate, I would not look favorably on expanding the House.
I would agree, and I'd add one other thing. If you do it, you'll have to build a new office building. Because there is no space in the existing office buildings to take care of the House and the members that you have now. You got 3 office buildings there, and you'd have to build, in fact, we have an annex with, that we're holding staff in now. So you'd have to build a whole new complex, certainly a big new office building.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liam.
Daniel.
So do you agree with President Trump that the State of the Union is strong?
Yeah, I do. I mean, look, we're the envy of the world in terms of the stability of our democracy. Our economy is growing at a very, very significant rate. We've rebuilt the military in ways that are significant. We've gotten the North Koreans to back down on the provocative nature of their efforts. The Iranians are on their heels, as they should be. And NATO has been provoked, but provoked to play a more significant role in their Article 5 issues. We're fully engaged with the Chinese on what they're doing as it relates to the theft of intellectual property and cheating on these trade issues. So I would say, yeah, we're strong. Do we have other big challenges? My word, we've got a lot of things that we need to deal with. But I would say I'd rather live here than anywhere else, and that's the proof for me.
I'm not sure I have the same point of view on a number of those issues, particularly overseas. I'm not sure that we are going to be better off moving forward on some of the policies that we're adopting, particularly as it applies to the Middle East. I think the Syrian withdrawal is quite frankly foolhardy. I don't think that's wise at all. I think our relationship with the NATO allies and the destruction of NATO is foolish, and I think it's short-sighted, and I think it's going to come back and bite us in the rear big time. I fully expect that we're going to see within the next 12 months Putin is going to make a move in Eastern Europe, and we're going to have a NATO partner that's going to be calling for assistance, and I don't think we're going to give it. And if that's the case, we're going to see NATO fall apart. I think that the lying that's taken place today does a huge disservice to our form of government. I think that much of the information, misinformation that's being handed out, contrary to people who are experts in the fields, is nuts. And quite frankly, I think it's a malfeasance of the office. You want me to go on? I can keep going. That's probably enough. But I have serious concerns. Now, I would agree if you're talking about the union itself and our country. Are we strong? Yes, we're strong. Are we as strong as we need to be? No. Are we as strong as we have been in the past? No. But we're strong, yeah. The question is going to be, what are we going to do to save ourselves? What are we going to do to deal and make some corrections? I think that, Ronald Reagan, I think, was a strong president. Ronald Reagan on details didn't know much. He didn't know much in the details. He had a heck of a strong staff, and he darn sure had the smarts to pay attention to people that were experts. And he followed the advice that he got. Jimmy Carter was, in my opinion, a very weak president, but he had a sorry staff. He was a very bright man, and he intended to do well, but he tried to learn every blooming thing there was to know in the federal government and ended up not knowing much, got him in a lot of trouble. So that's the difference. In this particular case, I'm afraid our president doesn't pay any attention to the people that know far more than he does about a particular field, and he certainly doesn't follow their advice. And I think that's dangerous, extremely dangerous.
Hi. So I think as young people, or at least for me, it's easy to get caught up in concerns and feel like things that are happening now in politics are unprecedented and a little scary. But in your experience, and you've had experience in the government for some time now, is what we're seeing now unprecedented? And if so, what do you attribute that to?
Okay, look in my eyes. This is very important that you not feel anxious about the future. Now, I'm not saying that we don't have things that we've got to deal with, but the anxiety, dump it. And here's why you should dump it. We've been through this before. So go back all the way to our founders. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, I mentioned this earlier this afternoon, they had a close relationship until Thomas Jefferson said and wrote outrageous things against John Adams, and it fractured their relationship for a quarter of a century. They didn't talk to each other until the year that they both died. Go to 1856 when a member of Congress named Preston Brooks walked into the United States Senate with a cane, with a walking stick with a big brass knob on it, and beat a United States senator nearly to death with no admonishment, no discipline. In fact, people across the country sent him canes to finish the job. Go to 1930, the year of my mother's birth. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, there were food riots in Minnesota. Or go to a group in the earlier part of the last century, World War I veterans who were marching. They were known as the Bonus Army. They wanted to get a bonus that they were owed from World War I. Herbert Hoover, as president, ordered that they be cleared away, and he sent in the United States Army to clear out, and I mean aggressive military moves in Washington, D.C. against peaceful protesters. Or think about two American leaders being assassinated within months of one another, Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. So what I'm describing to you is a capacity that this country has that's remarkable. You are getting into a car that can do a lot of stuff. And you've just not been on the bumpy road yet. And frankly, I haven't. It's not been too bumpy for me either.
It's been pretty bumpy for me.
But you take my... So are we feeling a little bit turbulent right now? Yeah, a little bit. Okay. But in the great scheme of things, and certainly in the great scheme of history, the freedom that you and I enjoy right now, and the relative prosperity that we're all experiencing, is not just the envy of the world, it's the envy of history. History. So if you're a person of faith and you're worshiping this weekend and you see some cops walking around, you're never going to suspect, oh, they're here to break us up. You're going to think, oh, the police are here directing the traffic after our worship. That's not true in other countries. Other countries, cops are there to take names and to put people under duress. So you take my point, that we've got a lot to be thankful for. I'm not here pumping sunshine. I'm not here telling you, oh, we don't have things that we got to deal with. But the hand-wringing and and I'm not describing that of you, but I see that around where people can be more anxious than is helpful. So let's just be smart about it. Let's recognize we got some challenges. Let's deal with them. But let's also recognize that we've got a lot of capacity as a country, too. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right.
Whoops, now we're not through yet. Don't you go running off. There's another piece to this, though. You did leave out one thing, and that was 1859, 1860 with the Civil War. Now, that was division. You know, when you got people taking up arms against each other, that's a division. It's happened once in this country. So that's the more severe and extreme situation. Are we to that point? No. I'm hopeful that we'll never get to that point again and have every confidence that we can avoid that. The other piece of this, though, is that I think it would be a mistake to assume that everything's going to just kind of rock along and, yeah, we'll kind of go to this side and that side and bang along here and everything's going to work out great. I'm one of those that believe you better work at keeping this government strong. And if you don't work at it and put in some effort, if you don't, in fact, challenge some people that aren't doing what they should be doing, then you're going to get in trouble. and you'll end up with a far more difficult situation. And very quickly, I'll add on to Peter's caning situation. There was a reporter killed by a House member on the steps outside the members' dining room back in the 19th century, 18th century, 20th century, early 20th. And so, you know, it's a dangerous place to serve in the House of Representatives. You never know when you're going to get caned or get your head bashed in if you're a reporter and write a nasty story. We haven't seen that out of any House members or the president.
Not in a while.
Not in a while. So anyway, but you gotta be vigilant. You gotta work at it. You gotta make sure that you understand that danger's out there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there. So regarding scandals on elected officials, specifically the presidency, and coming out of the new Congress that just came out of the wave of the new elected president, and coming out of Warren, out of Watergate as a Democrat, what do you see could be done from Congress to help alleviate these scandals and help elect officials that don't have these kinds of backgrounds, or maybe even just alleviate their aggressiveness, because because sometimes it can get to be a little bit much in the media and it's proven to be wrong. And so what do you think can be done to really kind of dial this down and actually get things done, as opposed to just focusing on stuff like this?
Well, I think that the first thing you got to understand that whether they're in Congress or in the White House, these are people. They're human beings, and we all got our weaknesses as well as our strengths. And sometimes we stub our toe. It's going to happen. The only thing that happens if you do it on that stage, you know, the whole world's going to know it. It isn't going to be, you know, some little thing that you can cover up. If it becomes a big thing real quick. The question of what you do about it, what penalties are to be paid, you know, we've seen that through history with Bill Clinton. You had it, and the impeachment trial that he went through, and the difficulties and challenges that he got. You had it with Richard Nixon, never got to the impeachment. He resigned from office, but there's no question he would have been impeached. And the reason he resigned is because he had the leadership of the Senate on the Republican side that went to him and said, if you don't, we're all going to vote for it anyway. So that's pretty good, you know, get out of Dodge, the votes aren't there. And I think each one of these situations is looked at, and going to have to be looked at, as the country wrestles as to how they feel about it and how they want to deal with it. We've got the situation we were talking about earlier in Virginia. Mm-hmm. We got 3 officials in Virginia right now, obviously years ago stubbed their toe. Well, does that make a difference or not? Well, I don't think we've arrived at that. Evidently, all 3 are going to stay in office, and we're going to deal with it probably for the next year or so, or at least the people in Virginia, voters in Virginia, trying to decide, do they impeach, do they not, how do they address it, we haven't arrived at a conclusion. If you do something back when you're a teenager or a few years later that is totally unacceptable, you know, are you 30 years later going to be penalized for that if you have a good record since then? The thing I think the lesson is on all this stuff under these terms, these times, is you better be the one that outs whatever problem there is. You better, you know, you're going to go out and run for office and say, hey, you know, I screwed up. I was divorced. And that was brought up in my first campaign, that I was divorced, and try to make a big deal out of it. These days, you better go out and say, hey, folks, you know, I got divorced back when I was in my 20s, and, you know, and this is the situation, so forth, and move on from there, because somebody else is going to do it if you don't, and you're not going to like the terms in which they put it in. So I think that's probably the lesson for people who want to be candidates or elected officials. You better get it out yourself as opposed to somebody else outing it, if it's something back in your past, and deal with it. I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's the best I can do.
Thank you.
Part of the challenge is the elected officials really are, my observation is Congress really is a reflection of the general public. And to the extent that there's super bright people in the public, you see really bright people in Congress. There's people who are not bright in both places.
They're
you know
dumb.
what I mean? And they're, you know, I'm being a little more gentle. You know,
You're a nice guy.
motivated by right things, motivated by wrong things, and so forth. So the idea of having a political leadership that's free of scandal is tough. And I know that's not what you're arguing for, but it's like, And sort of the wattage is all relative, right? So the wattage that offends you, some people love. And that's where we've got to learn how to interact a little bit easier. And also kind of not, sometimes when there's voices out there, that are in the public square, I choose not to listen to them. If, I know basically what their message is, but I don't spend a lot of time watching and listening to people and then coming back and talking about how aggravating they are. I don't want to give them that much power in my life. Instead, I want to try and live my life, and I know you want to try and live your life in a way that doesn't get off balance. And I think sometimes we can give too much power to other people by talking about them and thinking about them so much.
That's a good point.
That's true.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, I think we've got time for about 2 more questions, although it does my heart very good to see that nice long line. So I'm very sorry, but maybe afterwards our 2 members can stand around for just a second and answer some. So we'll get 2 more.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for coming. So my question is, what can be done to decrease the influence and power of PACs on our Congress and government as a whole?
I'll probably start that off because I'm way back when PACs started, and I was back familiar with the times before PACs, when you had cash in suitcases, and that's not good. Have people toting suitcases around. Went to, I shouldn't even say which convention, Democratic convention in 1968, and had this guy who was a lobbyist, came in from Washington. He came into Washington, he had a steamer trunk full of money. And he was in, and he was going to have an influence on those delegates, and he used all that money to go out and, entertain all the delegates that he could lay his hands on, and that's what he's doing. Those times were not good. That's what led to Watergate. So you got to understand, the Political Action Committee was a result and a reform of that period. So instead of this whole thing was Political Action Committee, small contributions come together and you can make the contributions. Now we've gone way beyond that. And so I think PACs, the concept gets all lumped in whenever you're talking about, huge amounts of money that have been collected by individuals and dumped into political campaigns. And American First ruling by the Supreme Court, I think, was a heck of a mistake, and I would like to see us have a constitutional amendment wiping a bunch of that stuff out. But when it started out, the whole PAC thing made a lot of sense. You didn't have a lot of big contribution. We still did it through electric cooperatives. The whole time I was there, the average contribution coming from co-op employees was $43, I think, the last year or so that we were in there. But we had thousands of folks that were kicking in there on an average $43, and so we would go out and make a $4,000 or $5,000 contribution to people who were supportive of electric cooperatives and friends of electric cooperatives, and that's kind of what we did. I don't think there was anything bad or wrong with that, but I think a lot of where I think you're coming from and what you're aiming at is huge amounts of money that are getting dumped into these campaigns, and that's just disgraceful. But that was a Supreme Court ruling that made that possible, and it's awful. This is kind of reform. I'm a reformed candidate, you understand, for office.
Right.
And I would say if I were writing a constitutional amendment, I would require that candidates running for office raise money in their states or districts. If you couldn't raise it in your state or district, you couldn't bring money in from outside that district. And I think that would do an awful lot to reform the kind of difficulties you're talking about.
The challenge is money is always going to have an influence in politics, and so the big question is, how do you create a system that's as fair as possible? So just as soon as you put in a restriction on states and localities, somebody will create a P.O. box or they'll do something, and you know what I mean? There's always ways to operate around.
That's true.
One of the things that I ran into was sort of the other side of this question. So I don't know, $14 million I think got spent against me in the last election. I'm guessing. Probably 14, I'd say.
Oh my goodness.
I'm not a cheap date, my friend.
You're not. I'm impressed.
I might be wrong, but it was 10, 12, 14. Okay.
Wow.
So a lot of money. the challenge is, if you're a candidate and you're running for office and you want to get your story out and you're holding press conferences and you're doing all this sort of stuff and the press doesn't come to cover your stuff, you've got a problem. You're relying on the media to tell your story, and they're not telling your story. And in fact, they may be telling a story that's not even right. And then you've got the big challenge to say, well, how do I tell my story? And therein lies, you've got to raise money to tell your story. And so this is not an easy thing to come up with. One remedy is to say, well, the taxpayers are going to pay for all these campaigns. Okay, well, I think it's a terrible idea, and I think a lot of taxpayers would resent being compelled to pay for everybody's campaign. You could say wealthy. I kind of like this because I'm not wealthy. I like the idea of wealthy people having to loan, or having to not just loan their campaigns money, but they have to put all the money in and can't be repaid. I kind of like that. That way they can't work the angle. But what I'm describing to you is a continuation of what Glenn was saying, and that is political action committees were literally the result of political reforms. They were perceived as a good thing. And I think the challenge of any sort of system is always the challenge of keeping it tight and fair all the way around. So there's not a lot of folks that I know that are really satisfied with the current state of play on campaign finance. I don't really know many people that are out there that are saying, oh, it's great, leave it alone. But I've yet to really hear a good argument or like a good solution about what are you going to do about it. Now I'm thinking this could be like a great capstone project for you or something. Like seriously, I mean this is to study, you know, what other places are doing, and then also what are smart limitations or smart opportunities to leverage technology. I think that there's something there. Just saying.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Or one other solution to your problem very quickly would be that we require that all contributions be poured into one great big pot and divvied up among candidates all across the country. How's that?
That'd cure it. No money'd go in at all.
None of go in.
All right, our last question for the night.
Question. Hopefully it's a good wrap-up point, but I wanted to ask each of you for a book recommendation. If you were to have every single person in this room read a text, or to a greater extent like the greater American public, if we had to read one thing to better understand American politics, what would that be?
I'll start. I got one.
Oh,
So to know us, to know who we are, we've got to know our story. There's a British historian, a man named Paul Johnson, who wrote a book called A History of the American People. He's a great historian. He likes us. He's a European who likes us. What a delight. And but let me just give you one insight into an observation that Johnson made. He said, look, all kinds of factors go into how history turns out. And we know this. We know this, you know, the economy has an influence, the geography has an influence, military power has an influence. All these things influence how history turns out. But he said the single most important factor in how history turns out are the people who were in charge at the time. And that's the great secret, in that we get to choose the people who were in charge at the time. So History of the American People by Paul Johnson.
Okay, thank you. I think someone's writing it down for me.
Well, the one thing I was thinking about, particularly after the discussions we've had here this evening, probably the correct book and I can't remember the title, is John Meacham's book that came out recently on, what is it, on America, but it's a very optimistic book. Gosh, I can't think of the name. You know what I'm talking about?
Not the one about, all I can think of is Meacham's H.W. book.
No. This is about, gosh, don't even have the phone with me.
We'll Google it.
But anyway, it's his most recent one's about and it's very optimistic about America. And I think that, you know, that really speaks to the best of who the American people are. And I think that that's probably what we need to focus our attention on, is encourage the best, but recognize that we're not always at our best. It's old America. There you go. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you very,
so
very
much.
much. You saved me.
All right, well, thank you so much. We really appreciate
Thank
you guys
you.
being here.
Thank you very much. Thanks, guys.